So, with 2 minutes to go, I will start building up Andrew Walsh, because it's a fantastic opportunity to hear Andrew speak this afternoon. The topic of practical playfulness, pedagogy and power, as well as being wonderfully alliterative, brings together all of the different aspects of teaching sessions. Andrew's a National Teaching Fellow, he's one of the librarians at the University of Huddersfield, and you've been a champion of play for so many years. It's been wonderful to see this idea develop and grow over the years, to the extent of having a whole journal devoted to it. It's just fantastic. The fact that you're learning how to sail as well and turning into a pirate just makes me desperate to try and avoid lots of terrible aha maharties all aboard now, that sort of thing. So I'm going to try and restrain myself. I think it's too late, but with no more ado, I'm going to invite Andrew to share with us all your knowledge on practical playfulness, pedagogy and power. Thanks so much, Andrew. Please save us all from me.
Thank you very much. And this is where you see that I haven't used Zoom for about 1.5 years, because I've mainly been using Teams. So if I break anything, apologies. So hopefully I'm about to share my slides. Can we see that?
You have achieved full slide success. Thanks, Andrew.
Fabulous. So yeah, I was in a bit of an alliterative mood when I set the title, but I'll tell you a little bit about what I'm going to talk about in a moment. But before I get started, I thought I'd say I'll try and make sure there's time for questions at the end. I'll try not to get too carried away with my sort of wandering mind as I go through this. But there'll be some interactive bits as we go through. I was going to do some quite playful things, but I then looked at the number of people booked on and thought, I'll better come back on that slightly. So there's a couple of interactive elements that have some hints of play in it as we go through. There's also way more content than I'd normally put on slides in these slides. So if anybody wants to go and look back at them and look at more details and follow up links, they're on the slides ready. So don't be scared by the amount of text on some of these. It's just for future reference rather than this in general. So yeah, add a little bit of a, oh, broken it already. Here we go. A little bit of an intro about myself. So yeah, I've talked about playing games and all that sort of malarkey for a few years now. Heavily into information literacy and play and game-based learning, and generally mucking about. So over the last couple of years, I decided I've done various things over my time, but it's never too late to learn how to be a pirate, as Isla said. So I've been learning how to sail a bit over the last year or so. So in this talk itself, what we'll cover is a bit about what I mean by things like play and playfulness in games and whatnot, to sort of set the context and to help prompt people to think about what some of the potential benefits might be from that. And that should hopefully lead into a sort of slightly clear idea of some of the things around power and inclusiveness that play and play-based learning in particular can help to enable. And then at the end of all my waffle, I'll talk through, I think I've got about 4 sort of really practical examples of games and playful type experiences that I've used in my work over the last few years to give some real practical examples of the things that I've done. Hopefully that's vaguely what people are expecting, and hopefully as well I won't get carried away and start waffling about other stuff as we go through. So my first little playful exercise for everybody is to do this, please. So I've got 3 minutes for you to go off and grab something really quickly in your immediate surroundings that sums up your current approach to sort of teaching library type things, and then post a sentence about what you found and what that item means, why you've picked it up in the chat. So 3 minutes from now, go. So I'd often sort of do this while people are still looking for objects. I'd often do this and get people to show the object they've found. And then once they've shown me the object, I get them to talk about it. So I get them to say why they've picked that object. And it sort of links together with some of the other stuff that I'll talk about later on. So fab, lots of stuff coming in. I'll give you 1 minute longer. There's mentions of things like tea and treats and coffee. And I think that's really important that we often forget in our teaching. It's really important for us and the learners to be comfortable, to be sort of happy in our spaces, that we can do our best, and very important bits of that. And while the last of you are posting there, I'll start to move on. So this is a sort of playful type exercise that I do in person and online as well when I'm teaching. I should have been a bit brave and pull a few of you out, but I thought with over 100 people, it's a bit risky. So before I go on to anything else, I'll just give you an idea about some of the terms I'm going to be using and sort of what they mean, or what they mean today when I'm talking to you. So these are sort of 4 terms that come up a lot. The first to say, gamification, is a word I won't use beyond this slide, but it comes up a lot when people are thinking about games and play in places you otherwise wouldn't expect to come across it. And the sort of formal definitions often say things like, oh, it's applying non-game elements it's applying game elements to non-game settings. But it's a slightly dodgy term, a slightly contested term. It's often reduced to sort of quite crude incentivification type ideas where you're trying to change people's behavior, often critiqued quite seriously by people, that it reduces things to like badgification, points and leaderboards and meaningless badges to try and move behavior. So I won't mention the word gamification again, and that's why. Moving on to sort of game, I'll talk about some games as we go through, and in the context of today, I really mean by a game the sort of the structure that people would follow. It's sort of some sort of thing that has probably well-defined rules, and it's probably got an end point to get to, and sort of an idea of how you're doing within that. And it's something that people would be able to play, but it's not play itself. When I use the term play itself, I mean the activity. So you can play a game, but you can also go through a game so almost like you're jumping through the hoops as an activity that doesn't move you into that play activity itself. And I'll talk a bit about some of the characteristics of play in a moment, because that helps us to think about some of the benefits that it has. So play is the activity, and game is like the structure, the thing that we play with or play through. And then playfulness. I often talk about playfulness a lot, and it's literally just full of play. So it's like the mental state where play is likely to spill over. So it spills out of your head, you're so full of play that you start playing naturally. It doesn't take much of a nudge to start playing if you're feeling playful. Playfulness is that mental state of being ready to play easily. So I'll talk a fair bit about games, play and playfulness as we go through. I've put this slide on for future reference. Please don't try and read it because it's a vast amount of text. The first really long definition is probably from the sort of granddaddy of sort of modern play type theory. And it's what a lot of the play definitions come from, and a lot of how people feel about play comes from. But if we jump to the second definition on this slide, it helps sort of give us an idea of those attributes of play. So when we play, this is what it looks like, this is what it feels like as a player. So I like this because it's just a nice, neat list of things. So I'll run through those and try and explain them a little. So play is done for its own sake, really. It's apparently purposeless. So it doesn't have a serious reason for it. It's not something you do to get paid or to get rewarded for outside of the game itself that you're playing. It's purposeless. It's sort of self-contained almost. Games, so playing is voluntary. You can't force someone to play because it's sort of how you feel. It's how you undergo the activity itself. So you can force people to undergo the motions of a game, but they might not be genuinely playing. They might not get those sort of benefits and those sort of characteristics of play. That said, although play is voluntary, it's inherently attractive. So if you see a group of people playing, it's natural to want to join in, to want to start playing yourself. If you see an opportunity to play with sort of low barriers around it, you're likely to start playing naturally. And along with that sort of attraction to start playing, it tends to have continuation desire, as they phrase it here. People tend to want to carry on playing. It's like a something you fall into and you want to carry on doing that thing. Often the ideas like flow come up with play, where people lose track of time, and that's that idea of freedom from time. So you sort of lose track. Things seem to sort of go like that, go really quickly, and you say, right, now's the end, and you go, oh no, there's half an hour gone past already. So there's that element of freedom from time, almost like you're transported to a different place where the sort of normal things don't apply. And alongside that goes a diminished consciousness of self. So people are more likely to be able to inhabit a different role because it's this different, almost a different place you go into, a different world where you can pretend to be a different character. You can do things you otherwise wouldn't have been able to do. You can try to see things from different points of view. And last of all, but really importantly, for the difference between sort of play and games, play has improvisational potential, which just means you can make stuff up as you go along. So I'll talk a little bit more about that later on, but when I talk about games, they're often highly structured and rule-based. If you're genuinely playing, you can change those rules. So I've thrown this slide in just for people to look at later if they want, about it's just one quite vague definition of games, because I find it's quite useful if you're planning to use playing games in your work, because it says, well, basically for a game, all you really need is a goal that people have to move towards, a set of rules for people to follow, some sort of feedback system that shows how you're doing with those rules to get towards the goal, and by voluntary participation, if you read the rest of the stuff, she's actually hinting at that it's actually play. You know, you can't force people to do it. It's got to be people wanting to do it and want to be immersed in a game for a game to work. But that sort of quite helps sometimes when you want to introduce game-like things into your work. And although I've talked about games being one thing and play in the other, if you really want to get into it, it's a bit more complicated than that, because there's lots of different play forms, and often in lots of languages there's only one word that means both of these things. So I'm using the word games as the set of things that you'd interact with, if you like, the set of rules, etc., and play as the activity, just for today. But it is a bit more complicated if you want to get into it. And if you do, there's lots of lovely looking at different forms of play in this Calwar book, Man Playing Games. So that sort of general waffle about play and games and playfulness and whatnot. Before I sort of start to say what some of the benefits that might come out of those ideas are, I'd like to ask you what you feel could be some of the benefits. So if you could go to menti.com type in that code 61007764 and just answer the question, sort of, what do you feel could be the benefits of play? And type in a few different benefits, and I'll give you 2 or 3 minutes and we'll see what sort of things people come up with. So we've got engagement and engaging and terms like that coming up as quite a major thing for people, and that's often one of the first things people think about in terms of play. So if we play, oh, it's engaging, and that naturally links to sort of the definition that I brought up that said play is inherently attractive. You know, people want to do it, want to take part, but there is a slight caveat around that, in that you have to do play well or playful activities well for it to be engaging, because sometimes it can be the opposite. So just that sort of hint of caution that if things are done badly, it can turn people off as much as it can turn people on. And I'll talk about that in a few slides' time. One of the biggest ones there is fun, which is fab. It's something I was reluctant to talk about when I first started to think about game-based learning and play and all that sort of thing, because I thought, oh, I can't talk about things being fun, things have to be serious. But fun's as good a reason as any, and sort of the softer side of things being fun and enjoyable for people to take part is really important for us as well as the learners we've got in front of us. And there's lots of other sort of things that I can run through in a moment there. I'll see if there's anything surprising. I'm just whizzing through them all. Yeah, brilliant. I'm going to jump back to my slides now. But while I'm doing that, I'll just pull out one that somebody said, defying the stereotype. And sometimes I think that's quite a fun thing to do, to look at the sort of expectations that people have in terms of what we're going to do with them and what we actually end up doing with them. It can make a big difference to have them go, oh, wow, you're doing something playful instead. So these are a few of the things that I brought out as some sort of major benefits of play. There's some other bits and pieces that people had in that word cloud there that I'll take a snapshot of later. But I think there's lots of overlap with the sort of things that I've put up there with the sort of ones that everybody else has said. There was hints, but only hints of the one that I've got at the bottom of that list. So people said things like, try and find some of them, sort of more inclusive and less intimidating, and peer learning, and a few bits and pieces like that, which I think are often tied with sort of some of the focus of my next few slides, which is about moving power to the learner, about moving away from that idea that's often quite prevalent in libraries, that we're the expert at the front and we're controlling the environment. We're saying what should happen and what shouldn't happen. What's the right way of doing things? You know, what's the correct way of doing things? And more into empowering the people in front of us to do what makes sense to them and works for them, and sort of socially constructing their own knowledge about that, which is often really important when we're talking about sort of professional subject areas like health and medicine, where there is a construction of knowledge within the environment. You know, there's a certain element of learning how to be a health professional that we can't force upon them. They have to do as a group and a community themselves. So moving power to the learner is tied up a lot with some of the inclusiveness that I'll mention. And I thought I'd throw in a quote from somebody else rather than me claiming that, which is sort of Bernie De Koven, that talked a lot about sort of power shifting to the player when we genuinely play. And they often talked about game communities as being those sort of games, being those sort of things in his mind, like competitive games and sports, where in those sort of game communities there were people in charge that would say if you're good enough to play with them, whereas he tried to focus on where people were genuinely playing and a lot more free to get those play benefits, where the players have control, the players can change rules to suit themselves. And because of that idea about shifting power from us at the front, us as the expert that says what has to happen, and putting the power in the learners, it naturally means that if they're playing during your teaching, if they're playing during your sessions, the activity tends to adapt to what they need. It sort of naturally becomes a lot more inclusive and a lot more adaptable than us just trying to think of every eventuality and giving our enforced structure within them. So playing naturally brings in loads of elements of inclusiveness to do with that shift in power. So I think the sort of the power in using play is often tied around not the activity, not the structure of the session that we're doing, not the activity that we've planned, but the activity that they actually do. So there's no one correct game or one correct way of teaching, but the real power of play in this sort of idea lies in successfully enabling play to happen or giving people permission to play. And I've linked there to a journal article where I talk a lot more about sort of how people tend to give permission for adults to play, that was interviewing a chunk of sort of play professionals that use play with adults, with grown-ups. I'm just going to jump past the next slide because it's a close-up of this for future reference, but I'll pull out a few key elements that let us take advantage of that the sort of things that people have talked about in terms of enabling play that allows us to get that power shifted to the learners, to get people to genuinely feel like they're playing with anything we plan ourselves. So there's loads of different ways. I'll talk about it a lot in the article, but these are some of the sort of top few, if you like. And the first one is simply to sometimes act a bit of a fool yourself to show that you're willing to play yourself. You're willing to expose yourself almost as a player, because it can be quite scary, first of all, to transition into play. So showing you as an authority figure that is willing to play can make a significant difference. One of the people that I interviewed did dance. He taught dance, and he'd talk about how he'd deliberately demonstrate things and demonstrate them badly and act a bit of a fool. We do a certain element of clowning about it to show that it's okay to play with the sort of physicality of dance and get things wrong and try again. And he'd give people permission to play by showing that he was willing to play himself. But often there's other ways that you can be in authority as well. So working in higher education, often, and I work a lot with teacher training type students, I might pull in some articles and say, we're taking this approach because this serious article says it's okay to do it. So bring in authorities that say it's fine, don't worry about it, it's okay to be playful. I do a lot of stuff with props, and that's what a lot of my interviewees talked about. Even really simple things. So if I go into a room, I might have Play-Doh or Lego or fidget tools or bubbles. bubble mixture in the middle of tables for people to interact with, that will encourage people to start to play on the tables outside of anything formal that I'm doing, because it puts them in that frame of mind that it's okay to play in this space, in this room. It is okay, okay to do these things. Lots of people also talked about how you can really enable play by easing people slowly into it. If I turned up to a staff development session, sat down in the room, and they said, "Oh, right, today for the next 4 hours, we're going to do lots of role play exercise about dealing with difficult customers." There's a fair chance half of us will stand up and walk out because it's far too scary to start doing something quite exposing, quite some fairly extreme type of play. Whereas if you ease people in with gentle type playful activities, things like that little exercise we did at the start where I might get people to share the objects that are important to them, that makes it a lot easier. But also when people start playing, if you can look out for the reluctant players, the people that don't really want to engage, and reassure them that it's okay to be involved with the group but on the edge and not actually playing themselves. So they might watch, you might give them jobs like keeping time for a game or reading out the rules or keeping score, so they're involved but don't actually have to play. And then you tend to find that people slowly fall further and further into the magic circle of play. They start to play more and more. Lots of stuff about making the space playful, because so many of our spaces are completely unplayful. If you sit in a large lecture theatre with 300 other people in straight rows facing the front, you're not going to feel particularly playful. So making the space more social, more relaxed, where people feel like they can move things around, interact in different ways, can really help. And you can do that in virtual spaces. So I'll often have a silly background and ask people, in fact I could ask you now what my background is, see if anybody can post in chat what the background is on my chat. So you can show that the space itself encourages people to be playful. And it's not just about being slightly silly with it or slightly social with it. It can often be about making it feel like a safe, enclosed environment. So if you're in a room with some learners and it's got a door open and glass walls all around with lots of people walking past peering in, that will naturally stop people playing because they will feel like it's a riskier place to play. Whereas if the blinds are closed and the doors closed, they feel like it's their space and the space can feel more playful itself. And people have got that it's Saturday swap shop for my youth. Yeah, that's my background today. I often have very sad sci-fi ones in there, but yeah, this is swap shop. But really important in this list here is to give people the freedom to change the rules. And I might talk about that in one of the examples as well, because often people will plan a game, plan to get people to play, plan strict learning outcomes, and if things start to go away from that, it's very tempting to drag them back to say, no, this is what I expect you to do. You can't be over there somewhere. You need to be in this little box for me. If you don't let people change the rules, if you don't let people sort of stray away from what you expect, it stops being play and you lose lots of the benefits of it. But there's plenty more ideas in which you can give permission for people to play a bit more. So hopefully I haven't waffled too much about on that lot. So I'll talk for the next few minutes about some practical examples of what I use. So I've got, I think, sort of 4 games or game-like activities, but often more important than that are the sort of little bits and pieces I do to give permission to play, to set the scenes that aren't officially games, but set that playful expectation up and that permission to play. So just as one example, I'll often if I have to deliver a lot of content, like I'm doing today, lots of slides, lots of me talking, I might randomize it a certain amount to split it into sections and try and make sure I can deliver that in any order that I need to, and get people to either choose what section's going to come next or get people to randomly pick what's going to happen next. And so I sometimes use these Christmas cracker ideas, which has a little prize in and a question or a prompt for me to jump to the appropriate stage, and I'll get someone to pick a cracker at random, pull it with the person next to us, and that'll prompt the next thing I do. I do similar sort of things with Pass the Parcel and a few other bits and pieces, which set up that playful environment. And also, really importantly to me, it lets people have their voice heard in a safe way. So once people have shouted out once people have said the meaningless thing that I've got written on there to prompt me to jump to the next bit, they're more willing to interact in future and more willing to say things further on in the session. So into my set examples. So one of the first things I did was a very simple card game. And at the time, it was just a natural extension of lots of the active learning things that I was doing. Very, very simple, handful of rules. People would ask a question to other people in the group. I quite like card games because they're easy to carry around. You know, I can carry 10 sets of these in my hand to go wherever I need to deliver a session face to face. And I've had like 60, 70, 80 people playing the game in a room. So it quite nicely scales up as long as I've got enough sets of cards to split them into relatively small groups within the mass. This looks very simple. It has very simple rules, but every time I've played it in a larger room, you know, when there's more than 2 or 3 groups playing, I've tended to find that people have genuinely started playing rather than treating it as an active learning activity where they follow the rules to the letter. So people will adapt what I've suggested, what I've put down as the rules, to work for themselves, to sometimes get around learning disabilities or physical disabilities. Often once I got slightly amused of a person of a certain age myself that should have reading glasses but don't, whereas one group on a table were all squinting at them and there's only one person could actually read the questions properly, so they changed the rules accordingly so the one person that actually had the reading glasses with them could be the question master for it. So as long as you allow that changing of the rules, that play to come out, it naturally becomes a lot more adaptable to the needs of the people in the room. Interestingly, this is the game that I've seen work the worst when other people have used it, because they've tried to enforce the rules. So it works really well when you encourage rule breaking and rule adapting, and it's to be genuinely playful. But I've seen it work really badly when people have refused to let that play in, to sort of encourage people to play, and instead of trying to stop it instead, because it's not what they expected to happen as the sort of person leading the class. Very different example. So all 4 of these things are very different. I do a lot of model making in classes, and because I have no artistic ability whatsoever, I use things that allow people to make models of some sort without having any sort of ability, because I can't do it myself, so why should they? So I use Lego, often based on Lego series play type ideas, where people would build models rather than talk about things themselves. So if I've got a room full of people, instead of saying, what problems have you got in constructing a search strategy, I might get them to build a search strategy and build the problems they've got in creating one. And then they talk about the models. So the model becomes a metaphor for what they're trying to talk about. And that's sort of the play that you get when that goes on. Really opens up the sort of quality of things that you get off the learners and the depth of learning that you get from them. I was going to say something else about that then. Oh, and it also has really strong elements of embodied cognition that often comes in through play, which is where you're thinking with your hands. So we're not just brains on sticks. It's not just our head that we think with. Normally, when we try and problem solve and think through stuff, we think with our whole bodies or with other parts of our bodies rather than just our heads. So the example I often use is putting flat pack furniture together. You don't read the rules and then automatically slot everything into the perfect place. You fiddle with it, you know, you pick objects up, you know, you'll pick something up and move it around and try and work out where it goes. We problem solve physically. And there's lots of variations to do with this that enables play. So it's not just Lego, it could be Play-Doh or drawing, or I often use collage these days. So people make up a collage to do the same sort of idea. Again, another very different idea is escape rooms. So I did my first escape room quite a few years back now, and we were sort of a group of us in this dark room and not quite sure what was happening and a bit confused about everything, and we were locked in, we couldn't move from there, and it felt like a library session to me, especially a library induction. So look, let's have a go at that. So we brought lots of the playful elements to use escape rooms for learning about libraries, and I've used it most often, I suppose, with induction type ideas, so learning some of the basic things about the library, mainly as an escape room in a box, so it's self-contained, and that sort of setting the scene, setting the boundaries of what the playful area is, can really help move people into a playful type area. Interestingly, out of some of the activities I've used, this worked really well with our autism lunch club at the uni, because I think the mixture of having quite clear rules and ambiguous things to do, together with a lot of freedom within that space, that combination of knowing what to expect but having the freedom to work within it, worked really well with those students. And finally, and I realise I'm waffling far too much and taking too much time, I've done a lot of play challenge type ideas. So these are some cards I used as a play challenge in the workplace, but I've used it mainly with students. We have this idea called Flying Start at our university, where we try to address some of the issues that mean we've got a higher rate than we'd like of people dropping out, and a lower rate perhaps of retention in certain groups. So we had identified certain groups where we set the first couple of weeks of term where we had activities, so they worked full days, so it's out that expectation about it being a full-time job going to university, but lots of stuff about community building and feeling comfortable in different spaces that seemed from our research would make a difference. So one of the activities that most of the Flying Start students have done is to go in small groups around the campus and do a series of playful challenges. So they play around the campus. Things like, I don't know, go to the canal and see who can make a paper airplane that flies the furthest. So they're silly play type activities, but it gives them permission to be in those different spaces and to work together in groups. It sort of makes it safe to do those things. I thought I'd get into trouble and only be able to do it 1 year, because in the very first year, one of my challenges was to take a selfie at the highest point of campus. And the building the library's in is the tallest building, but it has two sides. One side that the library's in, you can go up to level 14, 15, and it's some boring offices that nobody's ever in, so it's a safe place to go to. The other side of the building only goes up to level 7 and stops, and that's where all the very important people at the university live. So the vice chancellor, the pro-vice chancellors, all the sort of top knobs of the university. And the very first group that set off with me challenges bumped into the vice chancellor of the university in his office area and asked him for a selfie. Luckily, he went with it and was happy with it, but I thought that was going to be my last day at the university when I found that out. So there's a few different playful activities. I was going to skip past that just because I've waffled on far too much. But I've put a little video in the end of the slides that I quite like people to watch if they can afterwards, because it's a lovely example of how playful you can genuinely be in libraries. This is a conference called Counterplay that happens in a public library in Aarhus in Denmark. And if you watch this little video later, you can see it's just members of the public wandering past. You can get away with some quite playful things, some quite extreme play if you watch the video in places you wouldn't otherwise expect it to happen. So hopefully I haven't waffled on too much and I've got a little bit of time for questions there.
No waffle at all, Andrew. Great stuff, great stuff. You have excited our wonderful audience to so many questions. So, first off, I'm just going to go through them. I have plenty, but I'm just going to go through them to make sure that I catch them all. I like the idea of teaching via play and thinking about some disabilities. Playing might be a good way for teaching. How do you accessibility proof play? That's from Hossam.
Yeah, I don't think you can accessibility proof anything completely. You just have to try and think of the common things that might come up and do the same things as you'll do anywhere. So all the normal things about accessibility. I think the benefit with play is that people can then go further from that. So often when you're teaching quite formally, people will have to interact with your slides, interact with your voice, interact with however you choose to present it. When you've got games that people can genuinely play with, they will change the rules to suit themselves to make it more accessible. So the benefit of play is that accessibility becomes easier for the participants. So you can't forget about all the normal stuff, but it becomes a lot easier when you're genuinely playing because they feel they have the power to do that themselves.
Great. Becky has been asking a lot of questions and I applaud that. I'm interested in the grouping of students. Does true play allow them to group themselves? And also, how can you create a playful online space? Yeah,
in terms of grouping, I often have far too many to mess people about and start to move into groups. So I let groups form naturally. It is difficult and often comes back to one of those elements that I said about enabling play and letting people sit on the background almost, because often when you start to play, you'll see groups form and there'll be people on the edges of the groups, people that genuinely will be nervous about joining in with the play that's happening with their group for one reason or another. And it's being aware of that and trying to find ways in which they can engage with the group, even if they're a little nervous about engaging with the play, first of all, because then you tend to find that play comes later. And as you go through, they become more and more engaged. And that's when I was talking about things like, if you see someone on the edge of it, you might say, oh, well, in fact, can you be the games master? Can you look after the time? Or can you do this particular thing that keeps them involved, even if they're a bit reluctant to be officially part of the group?
So, question, sorry to have interrupted.
Yeah.
Are there risks or harms to the learner if they're on the edges in that way? Is there something that, yeah, are there any harms that we should be alert to the possibility of?
Quite possibly, but often when I talk about this sort of stuff, those sort of questions come up, and people will say things like, oh, well, you know, this person won't involve to it, or it won't work for them, or it won't work for me. And I tend to ask a question back, which I might do quite rudely. So tell me if you want to pick into it a bit, which is that if you do a chalk and talk or have demonstrated database for someone at an hour, how many people is that not working for? I tend to feel that when they're doing these very hands-on activity and very playful things, you can often see those people at risk and do something about it. Whereas it's a lot harder to do it when you're doing more didactic style teaching.
I think that's a really fair point that I will not pick into because we have so many other questions. Really short sessions 20 minutes, half an hour, a 10-minute virtual corporate induction session, how can you incorporate play into really short sessions? And I've sort of amalgamated a question from Alison and Rayanne to sort of link those two.
Yeah, the shorter the session, the harder. I wouldn't do something very playful in a 10-minute session unless they're already primed for it, unless they're already expecting it. Often I'll do these sort of presentations, and it does sound like I'm saying, play's the thing that you should do. That's the only answer, don't think about anything else. And it's not, it's just one of the options. So if somebody said you've got 10 minutes for this corporate induction and that's all you have to do, then I'd say, well, I'm not going to do anything playful because it probably won't be enough time to work for them. I'll pick a different option. So it's just something to select from, something from the buffet of teaching.
Yeah. And there's a question that's just popped into the chat. If the tutor is uncomfortable with play as a format, then they're not going to be able to do it as well as their traditional chalk and talk. So pick the thing that works for the environment as well as for you as a person as well, perhaps.
Yeah, completely. And I talk a lot, so that fits in with some of the other things. No one right answer, but I talk quite a lot with people now about personal pedagogies and them being based on the values and the beliefs we have about teaching and learning. No matter what people try to sell you, people like me, to say this is a wonderful thing, if you're not comfortable about it, really don't do it, because the best teaching comes from the place that you're comfortable with and that fits in with your beliefs and your ethos around teaching and learning. So do what works for you, even if idiots like me come along and say, this is the thing to do. Please don't.
We're hearing that, which is really great, and I can see in the chat there's sort of the buffet of teaching and the picking the session that suits better. There was a couple of questions around sort of the cultural implications of having your fun background as swap shop, and me as an oldie. I'm already turning this into a thing, but the cultural things around your fun background, I can spot it because I'm from the UK, I'm of a certain age, and so on and so forth. So what are the exclusionary aspects or the cultural aspects that you need to be aware of when you're thinking what you're doing is fun, but that's from your perspective? And again, I'm amalgamating a few questions and comments to that.
Yeah, and some of it's like the examples, like the backgrounds. So when I'm teaching with librarians that tend, we tend not to be teenagers. I can use references that are more likely to get a wry smile from that audience. Often with games, I try and pick things that are quite common international type ways of playing. So there are different forms of games across the world, and there is an element of trying not to do things that people aren't familiar with, and I often get that wrong as well. It's important to sort of pick that up as you go along and work out what works and what not. I got caught out once by doing a pass the parcel at an international conference, and until that point I didn't realise that the UK is the only people that play pass the parcel, because everybody else just looked blank at me when I tried to describe it, and I'm going, what? We tear something off? Why would we do that? So you try hard not to exclude people. You try to get those things that will work internationally and with lots of different groups as well within the UK. But it is possible to get it wrong, as with any other approach. So just constantly try to improve and get those better each time.
Absolutely. I'm conscious of time, but there's I think another question is the concept of learning objectives. If you let the players, the power is going to the learner, and the player has the power, and they can change the rules and everything else. What about our lesson plans? What about our learning objectives? What about proper teaching? Just tell me what to do. Don't make me play and work it out as a game. How do you deal with those?
Yeah, this is where I upset people, teacher educators at the university, who get inspected by Ofsted and are very strict about all those sort of things, because I'm perfectly happy if I don't meet my learning objectives in the session. I'm really happy as long as they get something out of it. But what I try and do is make sure they've got the material so they can come back and hit those learning objectives at some point in the future. And part of the reason for that is because I recognise that most of the time people don't actually learn stuff in our sessions. They get that. But no, it's not as bad as it sounds. But they get introduced to ideas, and then as they practice them later on, as they come back to them, as it gets put into doing work, then the learning happens later on. So as long as I've got that material in front of them and available to them, and they've thought about it a bit, I'm not too worried if they haven't had that light bulb moment in the session, because I recognise that they often won't. And that's the sort of thing where the ACRL talk about in their sort of information literacy framework, where they talk about threshold concepts. And when they talk about threshold concepts, it's not the understanding that happens in the session. It's about moving people into, they'd call it a liminal space, that space where they can start thinking about the ideas and start practicing them. And it could be 5 years down the line that they finally cross the threshold. So as long as they can hit my learning objectives at some point, I don't worry about during the session.
Yeah, there's a point about letting the group set an objective rather than you coming in with a predefined objective. That's a really good point made by Marshall just now.
Yeah, and I think I'm slightly more anarchistic in that I think they can change it as they go along as well.
Yeah, there is that, yeah, giving the power over, and they can, if they get something, that's better than you trying to force all the things that you hoped. You're never going to be, I think that's a really good point. I'm very conscious of time. There are more questions, and I'll share them with you, and if it's possible, you could maybe sort of put in a few words by email or something, and we can share that on our website afterwards. Thank you so much, Andrew. This has been absolutely fantastic. I've got so many notes down, and I'm thwarted by the fantastic audience by having so many of my own questions that I still have to ask, but really, really appreciate, and thank you. I think it's been really, really great.
Okay, thank you all for listening.
Of course, we'll be sharing the recording of Andrew's presentation, perhaps the slides, I think the link to the YouTube video as well, just to make sure that everybody's got access to that as well. So thank you very much, Andrew. We're going to pause because there were so many fantastic questions for 5 minutes until 3 o'clock before we make a start with the next session. So thank you, take a breather, have a refresh, come back in 5 minutes at 3 o'clock for the next session. Thanks very much indeed.